I believe this is peace for our time. Go home and enjoy a peaceful sleep. With such words, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed his compatriots on the 30th of September 1938 year. After his plane Lockheed 14 Super Electra, returning from Munich, landed at London's Heston, Chamberlain Airport, having just set foot on British soil, demonstrated to the crowd that had gathered at the airport, a piece of paper on which stood the signatures of Hitler and him, and assured that there would be no war. Chamberlain's speech, known as Peace for Our Time, very soon gained wide infamous popularity, because exactly 11 months later the most terrible armed conflict in the history of mankind broke out, the Second World War. Why then did the Western democracies sign the Munich Agreement with Hitler and Mussolini? Why did their plan fail completely? And what does the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact have to do with it? Let's figure it out. Hello. My name is Vladlen Muraev. You are on the channel History Without Myths, where we talk about the past without embellishments and falsifications. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and help us get a silver button by the end of this year from YouTube. This video is released on the 30th of September, just on the next anniversary of the Munich Treaty, and it is on this day, and in general every autumn every year the world remembers this story, and for us, for Ukraine, it became especially relevant after 2014 year. When the Russian Federation annexed part of the territory of Ukraine, and the world tried to resolve this problem with some diplomatic peace measures. One of the main objections from the side of, let's say, pro-Russian viewers is that the Soviet Union apparently has no responsibility for the start of the Second World War. It seems that the Soviet Union was never an ally of Hitler during the Second World War. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because it was a typical phenomenon for those times. In the end, it is the Western democracies that are responsible for the start of the Second World War, because with their policy of appeasement they pushed Hitler to new aggressions. Therefore, it is necessary to consider in more detail the Munich Agreement of the 38th year in order to better understand who and how much is to blame for the fact that the war began. So, 1938, Czechoslovakia. Germans make up about a quarter of the population of this country, some 3.5 million out of a population of almost 15 million. The absolute majority of Germans live compactly in the Sudetenland region. It is an industrialized region, one of the most powerful in Czechoslovakia, very rich in minerals. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, let me remind you, this happened in the 33rd year. They began systematic work on inciting anti-Czech sentiments among the Sudeten Germans aimed at reunification with their historical homeland, Germany. Konrad Henlein's Sudeten German Party became the exponent of such sentiments. Over time, it turned into a real fifth column in Czechoslovakia. By the way, absolutely similar to how Serhiy Aksionov's party under the name Russian Unity, we are talking about the same Serhiy Aksionov, who has been the head of the Russian occupation authorities in Crimea since the spring of 2014. Nazi Germany in March 1938 year carried out the Anschluss, that is, the annexation, of Austria. Immediately after this happened, Konrad Henlein, the leader of the Sudeten Germans, arrived in Berlin to coordinate his further actions with Hitler. And so, on the 24th of April, at the Congress in Karlovy Vary, the Sudetenland German Party put forward radical demands on the Czech government. To give the Germans the widest possible autonomy and clearly define its territory, to replace all Czech officials in these lands with German officials, to give complete freedom for Nazi propaganda in Czechoslovakia. In addition, on the basis of the Party Security Service of the Sudetenland German Party, in fact, the German security service in the Sudetenland was created, which was ready to carry out terrorist acts. Well, Hitler himself began to flaunt his strength and advance troops closer to the borders of Czechoslovakia. There was a reaction to this. The Czechoslovak government introduced its troops into the Sudetenland region, and in addition, France and the Soviet Union, which had treaties with Czechoslovakia, began to declare their readiness to support this country in a hypothetical military conflict against Germany. What about Hitler? Then he begins to act primarily by diplomatic methods, trying to deprive Czechoslovakia of support in the international arena and isolate it. At the same time, he constantly demonstrates that he is not an aggressor, but only seeks to protect the interests of the German minority in Czechoslovakia. In favor of Hitler played the fact that the neighboring countries, Poland and Hungary, also had territorial claims to Czechoslovakia, and in the 38th year Hitler absolutely seriously supported the claims of these countries. Just as in March 2014 year, the Russian Federation invited these same countries to take part in the division of Ukraine, but quite predictably met with an absolute misunderstanding of such a ridiculous proposal.
This is the fruit of some sick imagination. It is simply outrageous to suggest Poland participate in the division of a friendly country and change its borders. The proposals of the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia are so strange that no one even considered them seriously.
Negotiations between the Prague government and Heinlein's Sudeten German party lasted for several months, but they turned out to be just a waste of time. France and Great Britain verbally supported Czechoslovakia, but in fact the society of these countries really did not want to fight. The memory of the recent First World War was still extremely alive. About 10 million people died in this war, about 20 million were injured, and Western societies categorically did not want a repetition of such a colossal murder. The French remembered well that more than 4 years of World War it was on the territory of their country that the most important Western front passed, and it was France that suffered the most from this war, so they, of course, did not want to fight at all and wanted to preserve peace at any cost. Czechoslovakia had the very unenviable role of an exchange pawn on the world chessboard. On the 10th of September, 1938 year, the Sudetenland German party began an armed putsch in Czechoslovakia. In response to this, Czechoslovak troops were introduced into the German-populated regions. Quite predictably, Hitler was waiting for this. He began to threaten Czechoslovakia with direct German military intervention. Because of this, an internal conflict broke out in the French government. One part of the ministers was in favor of immediately providing armed support to their ally, Czechoslovakia. The other part of the ministers was in favor of appeasing Hitler and not interfering in this problem in any way. The Prime Minister of France, Edouard Daladier, was well aware that without the help of Great Britain, without the help of its dominions and the powerful fleet, France would not be able to defeat Germany. This was demonstrated by the experience of the First World War. That is why Daladier made a proposal to his British colleague Chamberlain, offering him to enter into negotiations with Hitler and try to reach a peaceful settlement. Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini agreed to act as an arbitrator, that is, an outside observer and regulator of relations between these three countries, but in reality Mussolini acted in Hitler's interests. Meanwhile, on the 17th of September, the Nazis created from the Sudeten Germans a so-called volunteer corps under the command of Konrad Jean Lane, which operated in the Sudetenland on the territory of Czechoslovakia, but Hitler's National Socialist Party, the SS and the German Wehrmacht were engaged in financing and weapons. This is a complete analogy with pro-Russian militants in Donbas, who were financed and supported, and are now financed and supported by the Russian Federation. In just 2 weeks of active activity, this so-called volunteer corps committed 239 acts of terrorism on the territory of Czechoslovakia, as a result of which 110 people died, 50 were wounded, and more than 2,000 were forcibly deported to Germany. The situation escalated to the maximum. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, flew to Germany 3 times for talks with Hitler. And so, finally, on the 29th of September, a fateful conference began in the Munich Vorbau building, in which the prime ministers of 4 countries took part: Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain, Edouard Daladier of France, Adolf Hitler of Germany, and Benito Mussolini of Italy. The negotiations lasted for more than half a day, in an extremely tense atmosphere. Only around 2 o'clock in the morning on September 30th, the parties signed the agreement. The Czechoslovak delegation was not invited to the discussion and was introduced to the content of the agreement after the fact. This agreement provided for the transfer of the Sudeten region to Germany by Czechoslovakia within 10 days, and with all fortifications, equipment and weapons, with all mines, factories, plants, railways, and raw material stocks. It was a territory with an area of more than 40,000 square kilometers with a population of up to 4 million people, which in terms of area is approximately equal to 3 modern Ternopil regions of Ukraine. In addition to the above-mentioned terms of the Munich Agreement, Czechoslovakia undertook to fulfill the territorial claims of Poland and Hungary. The participants of the Munich Agreement guaranteed the new borders of Czechoslovakia against unprovoked aggression. Within 4 weeks, Czechoslovakia was obliged to release from the ranks of its armed forces and police all Sudeten Germans who would wish for it, and also to release all those Germans who were imprisoned on charges of political affairs, a kind of amnesty for the militants. It is customary to blame Chamberlain for everything. They say, he is the one most responsible for signing such a shameful and capitulating agreement. It is worth saying that such an attitude is determined primarily by post-knowledge, that is, knowledge of how events will unfold further, as well as the works of Churchill, who spared no effort to criticize his political opponent and predecessor. For some reason, Daladier is hardly mentioned, as if he was an empty place, and not the prime minister of one of the most powerful countries in the world. But let's look at the memoirs of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, which he wrote already in prison during the Nuremberg trials after World War II. In those September days of the 38th year, Keitel was in Munich, meeting high-ranking foreign guests, and 7 years later he wrote the following in his memoirs. Few people know that it was Daladier who managed to overcome the stubborn resistance of the British Prime Minister with the following words: "We will not allow war, let the Czechs give in. We will simply force them to recognize the annexation of the Sudeten Oblast." His words were recorded by the chief adjutant of the Wehrmacht under Führer Schmidt. And here is the testimony of the former Reich Chancellor and diplomat Franz von Papen about the motives that guided Chamberlain during the signing of the Munich Agreement. By the way, von Papen emphasizes that not only the French and the British did not want war, but the German people also did not want the start of a world conflict at all, and all this despite this crazy Hitler's militaristic hysteria. Mr. Chamberlain was much criticized, and, in my opinion, unfairly, for his visit to Germany. For the Munich Treaty, he had 2 goals: to buy time for the completion of the rearmament program of Great Britain and, most importantly, to preserve peace on acceptable terms. The unbridled joy of the common people in Germany at a moment when it seemed that war had been avoided was sufficient recognition of his courage displayed in these trips. On the morning of the 30th of September, Chamberlain and Hitler additionally met one-on-one at Hitler's Munich apartment and signed the British-German Declaration. It was this declaration that Chamberlain demonstrated to the crowds at London Airport Heston same evening after arrival. This declaration spoke of the desire of our peoples to never again fight against each other and to contribute to the maintenance of peace in Europe through the method of consultations. Doesn't that remind you of anything? Consultation method is such an effective method. By the way, I would like to mention that this same consultation method is also prescribed in the famous Budapest Memorandum of the 94th year, which is still valid, so these are real security guarantees for Ukraine, aren't they? Somewhat later, on the 6th of December, 1938, in Paris, a similar declaration was signed by French Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet with his German counterpart Joachim von Ribbentrop. The document said that there were no territorial disputes between France and Germany, and both sides solemnly recognize as final the border between their countries that exists today. By the way, what about the Bolsheviks? The Soviet Union advanced its troops to the western borders, demonstrating, allegedly, its readiness to provide military assistance to Czechoslovakia in the event of German aggression. However, firstly, under the terms of the Soviet-Czechoslovak Treaty of the 35th year, the Soviet Union could provide armed support only if France was the first to provide such assistance, and France did not support Czechoslovakia. Secondly, Poland categorically refused to allow Soviet troops through its territory to help Czechoslovakia, because everyone understood very well that Stalin would definitely use such a wonderful opportunity to establish pro-communist regimes both in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and in general in all of Central Europe. Therefore, those who, following the old Soviet habit, continue to assert how the Soviet Union selflessly sought to prevent German aggression in Europe, simply forget the fact that, preventing Nazi armed aggression, the Soviet Union was going to carry out its own armed aggression in Europe. In addition, the intervention of the Soviet Union in Czechoslovak affairs could damage the aggressive plans of Poland itself. At the beginning of October 1938, in accordance with the terms of the Munich Agreement, Poland annexed from Czechoslovakia a part of Tesin Silesia and some areas of northern Slovakia with a total area of about 1,000 square kilometers and a population of 250,000 people. Thus, the leaders of Western democracies, along with Nazi and fascist dictators, grossly violated the sovereignty of Czechoslovakia. If everything is generally clear with the position of Germany and Italy, what guided Britain and France? They were guided by the desire to preserve peace at any cost, and they believed that by sacrificing a part of Czechoslovakia, the world could be saved from a world war. They thought it was an acceptable sacrifice. What gave them reason to think like that? They believed that it was possible to come to an agreement with Hitler. They could not even imagine that in fact Hitler is an intransigent tyrant who does not care about all agreements if he does not want to fulfill them and if he has the opportunity not to fulfill them. Here are Chamberlain's words after his first meeting with Hitler on the 16th of September 38. Despite the harshness and ruthlessness that I thought I saw on his face, I got the impression that this was a man whose word was trustworthy. It must be said that the Munich Pact further strengthened Hitler's position in Germany, taking away all chances of potential opposition, which was maturing in the bowels of the armed forces. And where did the opposition come from? The generals of the old school, who went through the First World War, realized that Germany could not win the war against France and Great Britain at the same time, so they believed that Hitler should be removed in order to prevent a catastrophe. As one of the most prominent British military historians and theorists, Sir Basil Liddell Hart, wrote, "For Chamberlain, the Munich Agreement meant peace for our time. Interior Minister Hoare declared that the world was entering a golden age. For Hitler it was a new, even more impressive triumph not only over his foreign opponents, but also over his own generals." After Hitler refuted all fears every time with victories won without any resistance and absolutely bloodlessly, the German generals lost both confidence and authority. Instead, Hitler became overly confident in constant and easy success. As he began to realize that further risky steps might lead to war, even then he believed it would be a small, fleeting war. The Munich Agreement was able to delay the start of the Second World War by 11 months, and although there is a view that in fact Munich was a brilliant bluff of Hitler, who was not going to attack Czechoslovakia, this is exactly what Keitel testified at the Nuremberg trials. And there is even such an opinion that if the World War had started earlier, in the fall of 1938, then Germany would have been defeated by Britain and France sooner. These points of view belong to the field of alternative history. We cannot know what would have happened if. The only indisputable fact is that, inspired by the ease of the Munich victory, Hitler and Mussolini continued to brazenly and decisively break the established world order. Or simply break its last supports. In March 1939, Hitler annexed the Czech Republic and the Klaipėda region of Lithuania. In April 1939, Italy occupied Albania. In September of the 1939th, Hitler attacked Poland, and only then did Great Britain and France dare to finally declare war on Germany. It finally turned out that Winston Churchill was right. The following phrase is often attributed to him: if a country, choosing between war and dishonor, chooses dishonor, it receives both war and dishonor. It sounds very beautiful. In fact, Churchill did not say such words, he said many similar ones. But not in this formulation, so I would rather quote what Churchill actually said, in his speech in the House of Commons of the British Parliament on the 5th of October, 38th year, i.e. immediately after the conclusion of the Munich Agreement. Without a war, we suffered a defeat, the consequences of which we will feel for a very long time. We lived through a terrible stage of our history, when the entire balance of Europe was disturbed, and when the Western democracies were temporarily given a terrible sentence, calculated, weighed and divided. Do not even think that this is the end. This is only the beginning of retribution. This is only the first sip from the cup of bitterness that we will drink year after year if we do not come forward, as before, in defense of freedom. So, in short, was Nazi Germany responsible for starting World War II? Of course, yes. Is the Munich Agreement a shame for Western democracies? Certainly, this is a shame for Western democracies and it is a crime against Czechoslovakia. Are Britain and France responsible for the start of World War II? Yes, of course, they are responsible, because their policy of appeasement of Hitler ended in complete failure. Was Chamberlain the most important responsible for the conclusion of the shameful Munich Agreement? No, the same responsibility, along with Chamberlain, is shared by French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier. Is responsibility removed from the Soviet Union? No, not at all. Because the Soviet Union had its own conspiracy with Hitler's Germany. And here the question arises, dear friends, why is the policy of appeasement of the aggressor still used on the world stage, if it failed back in the 30s? The history of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, which has been going on since the 2014 year, proves that the policy of appeasement is applied today. Why? Write your thoughts in the comments. It is useful to recall how the subsequent fate of the Munich signatories developed, and how the document signed by them influenced the destinies of millions of people even after the end of World War II. Neville Chamberlain died of colon cancer 2 years later. Having seen the complete collapse of his appeasement policy against Hitler, he resigned. And even saw the beginning of hostilities in Britain, when German aircraft bombed London. Edward Daladier, who above all dreamed of preserving peace and the territorial integrity of France, found himself in the German occupation zone and spent almost 5 years in prison, in particular in the Buchenwald concentration camp. Benito Mussolini was captured by his compatriots and shot by Italian partisans on the 28th of April, 1945, and his body was hanged by his feet to the mockery of the crowd in Milan. Two days later, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the middle of besieged Berlin in his Führerbunker. Although there are still many theories that perhaps he even managed to escape to Latin America and save himself, but this is from the field of alternative history. 11 days after Hitler's death, his Sudeten henchman Konrad Jean Lane in Czech Pilsen broke his glasses and cut his veins with glass. After the war, the Sudetenland was returned to Czechoslovakia, but the fate of the local Germans turned out to be very, very sad. The Czechs openly sought revenge on them and simply deported more than 3 million people to Germany and Austria. During this deportation, 15 to 20,000 Sudeten Germans died, while acts of mass executions, rapes, and robberies of the civilian population took place. Cruelty breeds cruelty, evil breeds evil. Well, now let's compare the Munich Treaty with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There are a lot of different myths around this, and let's start with the most important thing. The first myth is that the Second World War began with the Munich Agreement, and not with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In principle, this myth does not even need special comments, since everyone already knows so well that after the signing of the Munich Agreement, no war began in Europe. There were still 11 months of peace. The absolute majority of historians have reached a consensus that the Second World War began in September 1939, immediately after the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when Germany attacked Poland, and then Great Britain, France and the Soviet Union entered the war. Although some scholars believe that actually the countdown to World War II should begin from October 1935, when the Italo-Ethiopian War began, or from July 1937, when the Sino-Japanese War began. Or even since December of the 41st year, when the United States of America entered the conflict, but I emphasize that these points of view are in the minority. The second myth, the Munich Conspiracy and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact are quite comparable in their essence. Yes, there is a certain similarity. It consists in the fact that the Munich Agreement was about the division of the territory of Czechoslovakia, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, about the division of Poland, the Baltic countries, and Finland, but there are more differences, and they are colossal. The first difference is that the Western democracies signed the Munich Pact to preserve peace, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed by the Soviet Union and Germany in order to start a war. The difference is quite tangible. This is even stated in the secret additional protocol to the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, although, of course, in the form of a euphemism. In the case of the territorial political restructuring of the regions that belong to such and such countries, the territorial political restructuring of the regions is a war. The second colossal difference is that, according to the Munich Agreement, the Czechoslovak state was not liquidated, part of its territory was transferred to Germany. However, the Czechoslovak state itself continued to exist. According to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it was about the complete occupation of Poland and the Baltic states and the elimination of their independence. The third colossal difference is that of the four signatory countries of the Munich Agreement, only one country, Germany, received territorial acquisitions, the other three countries received nothing. According to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it was a typical imperial aggressor division of European countries, some to us, others to you. The third myth is that there was nothing special about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Everyone signed similar non-aggression pacts. Sometimes, by the way, it is added that the Soviet Union was the last to sign a pact with Germany, after several European countries that had done so with Hitler earlier. Indeed, the signing of non-aggression pacts was a common practice in interwar Europe. It was even fashionable, but this myth is a typical manipulation to hide the facts. The Non-Aggression Pact is one thing, but there was a secret additional protocol to the Non-Aggression Pact, and this is the most frightening feature. Myth 4, in Munich, Germany returned its lands, and according to the pact, the Soviet Union also returned its lands. In fact, Germany did not return its lands. The Sudetenland did not belong to Germany before. Before becoming a part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland region belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, talking about the Soviet Union is generally absurd. When until the 39th year did he own the west of Ukraine or the west of Belarus? The only fleeting episode when the Bolshevik authorities managed to visit these parts a little bit is 2 months, from July to September, 1920th year, when during the Polish Bolshevik War the Bolsheviks invaded these territories, but very quickly were knocked out of them back. At that time, the USSR did not yet exist. More than 2 years remained before its creation. Okay, maybe just an ethnic factor then? Germany wanted to unite all Germans in one German state, and the Soviet Union wanted to unite all Ukrainians and Belarusians in one state, by the way, as Soviet propaganda claimed. Well, here too, for some reason, it does not add up, because the Soviet Union declared the course that it is a supranational state that aspires to a world communist revolution. What does it have to do with the ethnic boundaries of individual peoples? It is not clear at all. And then what to do with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which until the 40s were not even partially part of the Soviet Union. Accordingly, the USSR could not say that it wanted to unite all Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians under its rule. Nothing works either. Maybe someone will then say that, okay, but before the revolution, these lands belonged to the Russian Empire, so the Soviet Union has some right to them. But this is a complete delusion. The Soviet Union was not the legal successor of the Russian Empire. The Bolsheviks, having come to power, renounced the Russian imperial heritage in every possible way, well at least at first, so if you admit it, well, it basically means to confirm that in fact the Soviet Union was just a rebranding of the Russian Empire. Myth 5, Poland in 1938th year took part in the division of Czechoslovakia, so the division of Poland itself in the 39th year is justified. Well, this is according to the principle if there are only bad guys around, then we will be the same. Manipulation and a typical example of a partial truth. Yes, indeed, Poland annexed part of Tessin Silesia, which was discussed earlier today. Russians love to mention this, but for some reason they do not like to mention that the majority of the population in this region were Poles, and in the 1920th year Czechoslovakia illegally annexed this region, taking advantage of the predicament of Poland, which at that time suffered from the invasion of the Bolsheviks. Therefore, all these 18 years, from the 20th to the 38th, the Poles were actually waiting for the right chance to restore historical justice. So why are the supporters of the USSR so indignant because of just the discussion of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the well-known fact about the alliance between the USSR and Germany at the beginning of the war? Because this is an attack on the most sacred, it is an attack on the myth of a great victory, and this myth is the heart of Soviet and modern Russian propaganda. This is the most important event in the history of both the USSR and Russia, and this myth is that the Soviet Union is the main winner. Hitler, Nazism and fascism combined, and therefore the whole world is forever indebted to them for this. And suddenly it turns out that everything is not so, that in fact the Soviet Union was a strategic partner, ally and accomplice in the crimes of Hitlerism for 2 whole years. And this is what causes real dissonance among all followers of the USSR and Russian peace. Subscribe to the channel History Without Myths so as not to miss new videos. We are waiting for your likes and comments. Until the next meetings.